Nobody really tells you what this particular stage of life feels like from the inside, not honestly anyway. You get the greeting card version, the version where everyone assures you it's supposed to feel peaceful, well-earned, a long-deserved reward after decades of work. And for some people, I'm sure that's exactly true. But for a lot of us, it doesn't feel like that at all, at least not right away, and nobody prepares you for the gap between what you're supposed to feel and what you're actually feeling. A gap that can be quietly disorienting precisely because you don't have the vocabulary for it yet, and everyone around you seems to assume you're fine. I want to pause here for just a second because I know some of what I've just described might be landing close to home for some of you, and I don't want to rush past it. If any part of this is resonating, take a moment, sit with it. There's no need to have an answer right now. But if you're the kind of person who finds these stories useful, who likes hearing how other people actually got through the parts of life that don't come with instructions, I'd really appreciate it if you hit subscribe before we go any further, because there's a lot more of this story left, and honestly, a lot more stories like it waiting after this one. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, not in some abstract algorithm sense, though sure, there's that too, but in a more direct way. It tells me these stories are actually reaching people, actually landing somewhere, and that keeps me motivated to keep telling them honestly instead of dressing them up. I'll be honest, when I first started sharing pieces of my own life like this, I wasn't sure anyone would care, wasn't sure a story about an ordinary person going through an ordinary hard stretch of life would be worth anyone's time when there's no shortage of louder, flashier things competing for attention out there. But it turns out a lot of people are quietly hungry for exactly this. Not spectacle, just honesty, just someone willing to say the true, unglamorous parts of a hard chapter out loud instead of skipping straight to the tidy resolution. So, if that's what's kept you listening this far, subscribing is a small thing that means a lot, and it makes sure you don't miss where this story goes, or the ones that come after it. Alright, back to it, because there's a fair bit more to tell, and I don't want to leave you hanging on the part that comes next, which, honestly, is where things really started to shift. I want you to picture something for me. You're sitting on a porch in the dark, sometime around 2 in the morning, and the neighborhood is so quiet you can hear the sprinklers clicking on 3 houses down, and you're not sitting there because it's a nice night. You're sitting there because going back inside means facing a bedroom you haven't been able to sleep through since March, and the chair on the porch is easier than the bed, and the dark outside is easier than the dark in there, and you've been doing this long enough that your daughter has started calling at odd hours just to make sure you're picking up. That's not a crisis. Nobody shows up with casseroles for that. That's just a Tuesday, when you're 71 years old and your whole life just quietly restructured itself around an absence you didn't ask for and can't fully explain to anyone who hasn't sat inside one. My name is Wyatt Hughes. I'm 73 years old now, and about 2 years ago I did something that my daughter called reckless, and she wasn't entirely wrong about that, not at the time, not from where she was standing with the information she had. But she visited me about 6 months after I did it, and what she said when she got here changed the way I think about the whole thing. If you want to hear how that went, stick around, and if stories like this are the kind of thing that matter to you, go ahead and subscribe now, because there's more coming, and I think you'll want to be there for it. Let me back up to where this actually started, which is not with a porch at 2 in the morning, though that's where I spent considerable time. It started 43 years before that, at a barbecue in Tucson in the summer of 1981, where I met a woman named Helen at a mutual friend's backyard party, and she was standing by herself near the far end of the yard, eating a piece of watermelon with a focused seriousness that I found, for reasons I couldn't have articulated at 29, immediately and completely disarming. We talked for 4 hours that evening, and I drove home thinking about a woman I'd known for 4 hours more carefully than I'd thought about anything in a long time. We were married 11 months later. We moved to Albuquerque because Helen's sister was there, and then to Phoenix because a job was there, and eventually, about 18 years in, to a house in a smaller city east of Phoenix that we'd always told ourselves was temporary and then just stayed in. The way you stay in places once they start accumulating enough of your actual life that leaving feels like it would require leaving too much else behind. Helen and I had 2 children, a son named Carter, who's in Denver now with a life I'm genuinely proud of, and a daughter named Melissa, who lives about 40 minutes from that house I mentioned, close enough that she and her husband and the grandkids were in and out of our lives most weekends once the grandkids started arriving. For 30 years, I ran my own small electrical contracting business, nothing large-scale, mostly residential work and light commercial, the kind of steady, unglamorous thing you build a life on without ever particularly planning to build a life on it. Helen taught middle school English for 26 years, and she was one of those teachers students came back to visit in their 20s and 30s, the kind who remembered the actual people and not just the classes, which told you everything you needed to know about the way she moved through the world in general. Helen died 27 months ago. Pancreatic cancer, which is the kind of diagnosis that doesn't really give you time to prepare the way some diagnoses do. From the moment we knew what it was to the moment she was gone was 4 months, and those 4 months were the longest and the shortest 4 months of my life, simultaneously, full of things said and things not quite said, and a particular quality of attention you pay to someone when you understand that the number of mornings you'll wake up next to them is now a specific finite number that is going down. I held her hand for the last 2 days. I drove home from the hospital on a Wednesday afternoon in a car that still had her library book in the back seat, the one she'd been halfway through when everything changed. And I returned that library book the next morning because I didn't know what else to do with myself, and it needed to go back eventually, and I thought doing something ordinary might help, and it did not particularly help. What followed, I want to describe as honestly as I can, because I think there's a tendency to either over-dramatize grief into something cinematic or to minimize it into a kind of tidy resilience narrative where the person finds their footing faster than is usually true. Neither of those was my experience. My experience was ordinary in the most relentless way. I got up. I made coffee in the pot that was still set to the size for 2 people, and I kept making it that size for months, because changing it felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready to cross. I ate badly and infrequently, not from depression in any dramatic sense, just from the fact that cooking had always been a thing Helen and I did together in a kitchen that was now mine alone, and standing in that kitchen cooking for one felt like doing a job I'd been hired to do in a building where my partner had just been laid off and nobody had updated my assignment yet. I fixed things. That's what I did. I'm an electrician by trade and by instinct, and when I don't know what to do with myself, I find something broken and make it not broken. So I spent the better part of 8 months doing every piece of deferred maintenance on that house that I'd put off over the previous decade, rewired the garage panel, replaced every light fixture in the house with something newer, rebuilt the back fence entirely, retiled the bathroom that had needed retiling for 4 years. It was useful work. It filled hours. It did not particularly make the house feel like a place I wanted to be when the work was done and the tools were put away, and it was just me and the quiet again. Melissa called every day without fail, which I want to say clearly was an act of love and not obligation. She is that kind of person, organized and present and deeply committed to the people she loves in a way that shows up as consistency rather than grand gestures. She'd call in the evenings mostly, ask about the day, ask whether I'd eaten anything real, ask whether I'd gotten out, and the answers were usually fine, something, and not really, in that order. She started mentioning communities about 6 months in, gentle at first, almost apologetically, the way you raise something with a person you're not sure will receive it well. She'd done the research, which is very Melissa, had a list of places, had made a couple of calls already to ask about availability and pricing. She sat me down one Sunday evening with a small folder she'd actually put together, actual printed pages with notes in the margins in her handwriting, and she went through them with me one by one, and they all looked fine. They were all fine, the kind of places where nothing bad would happen to you and nothing particularly would happen to you either. And I told her I'd think about it, and then I put the folder in a kitchen drawer and did not think about it. I want to be fair to Melissa here, the same way I want to be fair to every part of this story. She was not wrong that something needed to change. She looked at a father alone, in a house full of a life that was no longer quite the shape it used to be, and she tried to offer him safety, which is exactly what a loving daughter does. The limitation wasn't her love, it was the menu she'd been given to work from. When you're watching a parent grieve, the options you've grown up seeing presented are stay in place and hope for the best, or move somewhere with staff and structure and call it taken care of. Nobody had ever handed Melissa a third option, so she brought me what she had. What actually changed the trajectory of everything was a conversation I had with a man named Dennis Arguelles, which happened in a context so accidental it still slightly amazes me when I trace the chain of it. Dennis was the husband of a woman named Cora, who was a colleague of Melissa's at the school district office where Melissa works in administration. Cora had mentioned to Melissa, in passing, that her husband had gone through something similar a few years back, losing his first wife, and that he'd eventually retired to the Philippines, where Cora herself was originally from, and that he'd found, in her words, a completely different gear in his life there. Melissa mentioned this to me approximately the way you mentioned. The reaction I got when I first shared what I was planning was more measured than I expected, mostly because by the time I actually said it out loud, I'd already done enough of the groundwork to answer the hard questions, instead of just presenting a feeling and asking for blind trust. There was worry, understandably, the kind of worry that comes from someone who loves you and is trying to picture every way this could go wrong before it happens. I didn't dismiss any of it. I answered what I could answer honestly, admitted what I genuinely didn't know yet, and didn't pretend the whole plan was without real risk, because pretending that would have been its own kind of dishonesty, and I think dishonesty tends to earn less trust than honest uncertainty does, even when the uncertainty is uncomfortable to sit with. Eventually, after a long, quiet pause on the other end of the conversation, I got something short but real, an acknowledgement that fell somewhere between reluctant and genuinely supportive, and I understood, even in that moment, that it was enough, that I wasn't going to get full enthusiasm right away and didn't need it to move forward with something I already knew, deep down, I needed to do. What mattered more than that first conversation, in the end, was what came later, once there was actual evidence to look at instead of just a plan and a promise. Skepticism, I've learned, rarely gets talked out of itself. It gets shown over time through actual results, until eventually it quietly gives way on its own, without anyone needing to win an argument about it. Something you don't actually expect to lead anywhere, just filling conversation on one of those evening calls, and I filed it away, without comment, and thought about it, quietly, for 3 weeks, before I asked her to put me in touch. Dennis and I had a phone call that ran almost 2.5 hours, which is not something I typically do. I am not a long phone call person under most circumstances. But I didn't want to hang up, because Dennis talked about his own experience with a directness and a lack of performance that I trusted immediately. He'd moved to a city called Dumaguete, on the island of Negros Oriental about 4 years earlier, and he talked about what it had actually been like, not the postcard version, the real version, the weeks of adjustment, the things that were harder than expected, the things that turned out to be completely different from what he'd imagined, in ways that had turned out mostly to be improvements. He talked about the cost of living with specifics, not vague impressions. He talked about healthcare with specifics. He talked about the particular quality of community he'd found there with a warmth that didn't sound manufactured, the kind of warmth that only comes out of someone describing something they've actually lived, rather than something they want you to believe. He also said something that stayed with me for a long time after we hung up. He said that what grief actually needs, more than anything else, is not comfort in the sense most people mean when they offer it. What grief needs is novelty in small, manageable doses, the gentle friction of being somewhere unfamiliar enough that your brain has to stay present just to navigate it, because presence, the kind you can't fake your way through, is the one thing grief actively destroys if you let it settle into a routine of sameness in a space full of static memory. He said that nothing had cured or resolved or fixed his grief, and that he hadn't been looking for any of those things, but that moving somewhere entirely new had given the grief somewhere to exist inside a life again, instead of just occupying the whole available space. I looked up Dumaguete that same evening. Then I started reading about the Philippines more broadly. Then I was up until 1 in the morning reading expat forums the way I used to read trade manuals back when I was still building the business, with the specific, narrowed focus of someone who has identified a problem and is systematically working through the available literature on it. I read about the special resident retirees visa, about the healthcare system, about specific cities and towns, and what made each of them different from the others, in ways that actually mattered for daily life. I read posts from American retirees and British retirees and Australian retirees, and from Filipino men and women who'd spent time abroad and come home, all describing versions of a life I'd never seriously considered possible for someone in my position, which is to say, a 71-year-old man from Arizona with a contractor's hands and a grief he didn't know what to do with, and no particular reason left to stay where he was, except inertia and the fear of being misunderstood. I told Melissa I was going to take a trip. I framed it deliberately as exploratory, which was true, because I hadn't committed to anything yet. I just needed to see whether what Dennis had described matched anything that could actually exist in reality for a person like me, rather than just for a person like Dennis. Melissa's reaction was immediate and concerned, and completely understandable. She asked who I'd be staying with. I told her Dennis had connected me with a few people he knew in Dumaguete who'd agreed to show me around, older retirees, one American and one Australian, and a couple of retired Filipino professionals who were part of a loose community Dennis had become part of over the years. She asked whether I'd be safe traveling alone. I told her I'd been traveling alone since before she was born, which was true, but perhaps not the most reassuring framing I could have chosen. She asked whether I'd seen a doctor recently, and whether I had enough medication for a longer trip than planned. I had, and I did, because I'd already been planning longer than I'd admitted, she said, at the end of that conversation, with a careful steadiness in her voice that I recognized as the voice she uses when she's worried about something, but has decided not to fight it directly. Dad, I just want you to be careful. I need you to be careful. I told her I would be. I meant it, though I also knew that careful, in this context, meant something different to her than it did to me. To Melissa, careful meant staying close enough to what was known and familiar that nothing unexpected could happen. To me, At that point, careful meant making a considered decision about how to spend whatever time I had left, rather than letting that decision be made for me by default and inertia. I flew into Cebu and took a fast ferry down to Dumaguete, which sits on the southeastern coast of Negros Oriental, looking across the strait toward a string of smaller islands, with a central boulevard running along the waterfront that at any given hour of the day has people walking and eating and sitting and doing nothing in particular in that easy, unhurried way that takes some getting used to when you're from a place where doing nothing in particular in public requires a specific justification. Dennis had arranged for a man named Edgar to meet me at the port, a retired teacher in his mid-60s who had the particular quality of patience that certain teachers develop over long careers, the ability to let a person arrive at their own understanding without pushing them toward it. Edgar put me in the back of a car and talked about the city the whole drive to my guest house. Not a tour guide speech, just someone describing a place he knew well to someone who was seeing it for the first time. I want to describe what Dumaguete actually looked like to me in those first few days, because I think the reality of a place is always more nuanced than what either the enthusiasts or the skeptics tend to report. It was smaller than I'd expected, a city that runs more like a large town in terms of how people actually navigate and relate to each other, with a university at its center that gives it a particular energy, younger than you'd expect, livelier, with a cafe culture and a bookstore culture and a street food culture that operates pretty much around the clock. The waterfront boulevard, which locals call the Rizal Boulevard, was exactly what Edgar had described, the social spine of the city, where old men played chess in the morning, and families walked in the evening, and food vendors set up, and the strait glittered in the late afternoon light, with those smaller islands sitting on the horizon, like something someone had placed there decoratively. The heat was real and immediate, and required adjustment. I won't pretend otherwise. But Dennis had prepared me for that, had told me that the first week your body runs hot and confused, and then something shifts and you recalibrate. And he was right. By day 8 I'd stopped noticing it as the constant primary fact of my environment, and started noticing it as just one element of a place that contained many elements. Dennis's contacts introduced me around over the following 2 weeks, with a generosity that I found, frankly, slightly overwhelming for someone who'd been operating in a social universe of near zero for the better part of 2 years. There was a man named Robert, a retired civil engineer from California who'd been in Dumaguete for 7 years, who met me for coffee the second morning and spent 3 hours telling me everything he wished someone had told him before he moved. The administrative realities, the banking situation, the health insurance specifics, the things that were actually true versus the things that people wrote online because they sounded good. Robert was methodical and specific in a way that matched my own instincts, and I liked him immediately for not overselling it, for saying flatly when something was complicated or genuinely inconvenient, because the willingness to acknowledge the inconvenient parts made the good parts more credible. There was a woman named Soledad, who went by Sol, who ran a small guest house 2 streets from the waterfront, and who seemed to know, with an almost uncanny precision, when guests needed to be left alone and when they needed to be talked to, and who made the kind of decisions about those 2 things without asking that suggested she'd spent a lifetime reading people correctly. She sat with me one evening on the small terrace off the guest house common room, without any particular preamble or announced purpose, and asked me straight out, in the way that certain people from certain cultures can ask things straight out without it feeling aggressive, what I was actually looking for by being here. I thought about the question for longer than felt comfortable before I answered. I told her I wasn't entirely sure, that I knew what I was moving away from, but wasn't yet certain what I was moving toward, and she nodded and said that was, in her experience with the kind of person who ended up at her guest house for more than a few nights, a perfectly good place to start, that you didn't need the destination to know you needed to leave. I met a retired physician named Dr. Constantino, who ran a small clinic near the university, and who became, in the span of about an hour over lunch, the person who most directly addressed the healthcare question that I knew would be the first and most persistent concern Melissa raised when I told her what I was actually considering. Dr. Constantino walked me through the medical infrastructure of the city with a matter-of-fact completeness that included both what was genuinely excellent and what the real limitations were, because he said, and I believed him, that a man making a decision of this size deserved to understand both. He told me which conditions were managed well locally and at what cost, and which conditions would realistically require travel to a larger center, and helped me understand what an appropriate international health insurance plan needed to actually cover for a man of my age and health history. He also gave me a number I still have saved in my phone, his personal cell, and said that if I moved here and ever needed to reach someone who knew both the medical landscape and the specific contours of my situation, he was that person. I've never forgotten that lunch, not because it resolved everything, but because it was the first conversation I'd had in 2 years where someone engaged with the full complexity of my situation, rather than just the parts that were comfortable to discuss. I flew home after 17 days with a decision that was, if not fully formed, at least structurally sound enough that I could feel which direction it was pointing. I spent the next 5 months doing what I should have been doing all along, which was building the actual architecture of a life change, rather than just thinking about one. I worked with an attorney to review everything financial and legal, set up the international health insurance policy with the specific coverage Dr. Constantino had recommended I prioritize, researched the SRRV process thoroughly enough that I could answer questions about it from Melissa without having to look anything up, which mattered more than it might sound, because going into that conversation with documentation rather than vague reassurances was the thing that made the difference between a worried daughter and a slightly less worried daughter. Selling the house was its own process. 31 years in that house. 3 kids' worth of scuff marks on walls I'd painted 4 times. A workshop in the garage that still had Helen's handwriting on the label maker she'd used to organize my parts drawers because she said my organization system was chaos in physical form, and she had not been wrong. I sat in that workshop for a long time on the last day before the movers came, and I didn't try to talk myself out of the grief of it. I just let it be what it was, which was the closing of something real and long and irreplaceable. And then I got up and I kept going, because that's what there was to do. I kept the label maker. It's in a kitchen drawer in my apartment here right now, still with her handwriting on it, still labeled in her system that was better than mine. I've never reorganized the drawer she would have organized differently. Telling Melissa what I was actually doing, not exploring but doing, was the conversation I'd been building toward and dreading simultaneously for months. She went quiet for a long moment when I laid it out plainly, and then she said, without accusation, but with the specific weight of someone who is frightened and trying not to show it to the degree they feel it, "Dad, that's really far away if something goes wrong." I told her I understood exactly why she felt that way, that I'd thought about that specific fear more carefully than she knew, and then I walked her through everything I'd built, the insurance documentation, Dr. Constantino's contact information, Robert and Edgar's numbers as people on the ground who knew the city and could respond to anything faster than any facility 40 minutes from her house could respond to something that happened to me in Arizona. She was quiet again, longer this time. Then she said, "You've been planning this for months, haven't you?" It wasn't quite a question. I told her yes, more or less, since that phone call with Dennis, that she'd made possible by mentioning it, and she made a small sound that I couldn't entirely read, something between exasperation and something else I didn't have a name for yet. She said, before we hung up, "I think this might be reckless, Dad. I want you to know, I think this might be reckless." I told her that was fair. I told her I might even agree with some version of that there was probably a definition of reckless under which a 71-year-old man alone moving to Southeast Asia qualified, and that I'd made peace with that possibility because the alternative was continuing to do something that felt, to me, like slowly and safely coming to an end inside a house in Arizona, and I wasn't willing to call that safety if this was what safety looked like. Carter was more contained in his response, more analytical, asked questions about finances and logistics, and made me walk him through the insurance coverage twice, the second time taking notes, which is very Carter, and by the end of that conversation he'd moved from skeptical to what he called cautiously supportive, which from a careful person is a meaningful distance to travel in a single phone call. I flew out in early spring. One way. 2 large bags and a carry-on with medications and documents, and Helen's label maker wrapped in a flannel shirt so it wouldn't rattle around. The first months were harder than I'd fully prepared for, and I prepared fairly thoroughly, so that's saying something. Not hard in the dramatic way, not frightening, just the grinding, ordinary difficulty of being somewhere new when you're no longer young and your brain doesn't absorb novelty quite as frictionlessly as it once did. I got lost regularly. I ordered things at restaurants I couldn't fully identify and ate them anyway, which turned out, more often than not, to be better than expected, the kind of cooking that is casual and particular and regional in a way that reminded me of visiting my grandmother in New Mexico as a child, food that belonged completely to a place. I made mistakes in transactions, overtipped badly in ways that caused mild confusion, undertipped in ways that caused quiet offense. I only understood later when Edgar explained the local conventions with a patience I didn't deserve but received anyway. Edgar became something I hadn't expected him to become, which was a genuine friend. Not the managed, at-arm's-length friendliness of a host with a guest, but the actual kind. The kind where you say the honest thing rather than the comfortable thing. Edgar had lost his own wife about 3 years before I arrived, and we found, fairly quickly, that we could talk about that with each other in a way that neither of us could easily talk about it with people who were still a couple. Because there's a specific grammar to widowhood that you either know from the inside or you don't, and Edgar and I both knew it and didn't have to explain it to each other from scratch. About 3 months in, Edgar mentioned, almost in passing, that a neighborhood association near where I'd taken an apartment was looking for someone with a construction or electrical background to help assess some repair priorities for a small community center that served mostly elderly residents in the area, a building that needed work but that nobody had the professional knowledge to properly scope. I went and had a look the following Thursday out of simple professional curiosity, and I walked out of that building 4 hours later with a 7-page handwritten assessment and a commitment to come back the following week to help supervise the initial phase of the repair, which was supposed to take 2 weeks and ended up running nearly 3 months, and those 3 months were some of the most useful I'd felt in years. The community center work connected me to people I'd otherwise never have met, including a man named Mang Ernesto, who was 81 years old and had been coming to that center every weekday for 11 years and who had strong opinions about every decision being made about its renovation, most of which he shared directly with me regardless of whether I'd asked for them. Mang Ernesto's opinions were delivered with the particular authority of someone who has long since stopped filtering himself for social comfort. And while this made the renovation process occasionally contentious, it also made him, I found, the most honest person I interacted with on a given day, and I started looking forward to his assessments of my work with something approaching genuine need. There was a woman named Tessie, who managed the center's programming and who had the energy of someone half her actual age, which turned out to be 64, and who recruited me, about 6 weeks into the renovation, to sit in on a session she ran for senior residents on basic home electrical safety, which devolved fairly quickly into a 2-hour practical workshop that I essentially took over from her, out of professional instinct, and which she received with a generosity I hadn't expected. Afterward telling me, matter-of-factly, that I should do a proper workshop series, that there were at least 40 residents in the immediate area who would benefit from understanding the basics, and that she would organize it if I would commit to showing up. I showed up every Saturday morning for 4 months. What started as a safety workshop evolved into something more like a community gathering, because Tessie understood, better than I did, that the nominal subject wasn't really the point. The point was the gathering itself, the reason for people who might otherwise stay home alone to show up somewhere and be in a room with other people, which is, I've come to understand, one of the most quietly important things you can construct for people at a certain age, including yourself. There was a morning, about 5 months in, when I woke at my normal time and lay in bed for a moment, running through what the day actually held, the way I'd noticed I was starting to do again, not with dread, but with a kind of practical orientation, the way you might review a schedule. And I realized that the list of things I needed to do and wanted to do and had agreed to do had grown long enough that I was going to have to make actual choices about the order of it, and the feeling of that, the feeling of a day that required prioritization rather than just endurance, was so unfamiliar and so welcome that I lay there for longer than necessary just to sit with it. I had a health scare about 7 months in. Nothing catastrophic, a blood pressure situation that escalated faster than it should have because I'd been less consistent about my medication than I should have admitted to anyone, including myself. And I ended up spending a night at a hospital that Robert had told me about during those first weeks, a private facility about 12 minutes from my apartment that Dr. Constantino had also specifically vouched for. Edgar drove me and stayed the entire night in a waiting room chair, despite my telling him 3 separate times that he should go home. Dr. Constantino called the attending physician directly, from memory, having kept track of my care situation the way he'd said he would, and the attending physician came to my room the following morning with the specific context of my medical history already in hand, which meant I didn't have to reconstruct it from scratch while feeling unwell, which is the thing nobody thinks to plan for until they're in that situation. The entire visit, overnight observation and tests and consultation included, came to a bill that I stared at for a long time, not because it was alarming, but because it was so far below what the same night in an American hospital would have cost, that it felt like a number I might have written down wrong. I had not written it down wrong. The international insurance covered the majority of it anyway, but the baseline cost itself was the kind of thing that reframes certain assumptions you've been carrying around without examining them. I called Melissa the next morning from the hospital room before I was discharged, because I was not going to let her find out later and spend days imagining the worst version of it. She was quiet when I finished describing the night, and then she asked the question I'd been expecting, which was, who had been with me? I told her about Edgar in the chair all night, and Dr. Constantino's phone call, and Robert, who had shown up at 7 in the morning with breakfast he'd picked up on the way over. She was quiet again for a moment, a different quality of quiet than the worried one I'd been hearing from her for a year and a half. Then she said, slowly, "That's more people than were there when you had that thing with your back in Phoenix, and I lived 40 minutes away." I told her yes. That had occurred to me as well. She came to visit 8 months after I moved. I could hear the anxiety in her voice on the flight-related calls in the week beforehand, the specific combination of love and unease that I'd been hearing from her since the day I first mentioned the trip to Dumaguete, now sharpened by the fact that she was actually coming here rather than imagining it from Arizona. I met her at the airport in Cebu with Edgar, who had insisted on driving on the grounds that he knew the roads, and I still navigated by a combination of gut instinct and optimism that he found professionally alarming. I want to describe what Melissa's visit looked like, because it's what most of this story has been building toward, even if I've taken the long route to get there, which is probably the only route I know how to take. She arrived with the careful alertness of someone who has been bracing themselves for a specific thing and is now looking for evidence of whether that thing is true. She was looking for the version of me she'd feared, the version that had made a reckless choice and was now living alone and diminished in a place nobody she knew could reach easily. She was looking for that and trying not to look for it, simultaneously, because she's a fair person and she knew she owed it to me to see what was actually here before she judged it. What she saw on the first morning was Edgar at my kitchen table drinking coffee at 7 in the morning because he'd come over to help me set up a ceiling fan I'd been procrastinating about, which had turned into coffee and a discussion about a local election that had gotten complicated and which he'd been too absorbed in to leave. What she saw was an apartment that was, by any measure, lived in, not just occupied. Her word, later, was that it looked like a home that has things going on in it, which is different from a home that is being maintained, a distinction she apparently saw clearly. We walked the boulevard that first evening, all three of us, and I pointed out the food stalls where I'd become a regular, and the spots where Edgar and I usually sat in the mornings, and the direction of the community center I'd been working with. Melissa was quieter than usual, absorbing, and I gave her space to do that without narrating everything, because she needed to see it directly rather than through my description of it. She met Saul the second day, and Saul did with Melissa what Saul does with everyone, which is see them accurately and respond to what she actually sees rather than what she expects to see. And what Saul apparently saw in Melissa was a woman who was carrying a long period of sustained worry and needed to be given permission to put some of it down. I don't know exactly what they talked about during the half hour I was on a call with Carter, but when I came back, Melissa had a look on her face I recognized as the look of someone who has received a perspective they hadn't considered and is still working through what to do with it. She met Dr. Constantino over lunch the third day, and I watched her do what she always does with people she's evaluating seriously, which is ask very specific questions and listen to the answers with her entire attention, and then ask follow-up questions that reveal she was actually listening the first time. Dr. Constantino answered everything with the same no-nonsense completeness he'd offered me 2 years earlier, and by the end of that lunch I could see something changing in Melissa's posture. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the specific easing of a person who has been holding a sustained tension and is beginning, incrementally, to release it. She came to a Saturday morning session at the community center, the workshop series that Tessie had organized and that I'd been running for months by then. There were about 20 residents in the room that morning, a range of ages, mostly 60s and 70s, but with a couple of older attendees who'd been coming since the start and treated the sessions as something close to a social obligation. Mang Ernesto was there, in his usual chair in the second row, ready to disagree with anything I said that he felt required disagreement. I introduced Melissa to the room at the start of the session, and the room responded to her the way rooms here often respond to a newcomer who seems connected to someone they already know, with a warmth that she told me later she hadn't expected and wasn't quite prepared for. Mang Ernesto, to absolutely no one's surprise, had questions for Melissa during the break, direct ones, about where she was from and what she did, and whether she'd been to the Philippines before. And then, in his particular way, a question that wasn't quite a question, more of an observation delivered as a question, whether she'd noticed that her father seemed different here than she'd perhaps expected. Melissa told him, later, that she'd had to think about how to answer that, because the honest answer was yes, and that admitting yes felt like admitting something she hadn't entirely let herself think directly yet. She told Mang Ernesto yes, and he nodded, as though this confirmed a thing he already knew, and went back to his coffee. There was an evening toward the middle of her visit when we sat on the small terrace off my apartment in the early evening, the sky doing the particular thing it does here, in the late afternoon, where the light goes golden and the strait catches it, and everything has a quality of warmth that isn't quite like anything I'd seen in Arizona or anywhere else I'd spent time. Melissa had been quieter all day than she'd been the previous days, processing something, and I'd given her room to do it. We sat out there for a while without saying much, and then she turned to look at me in a way that I recognized as the look she has right before she says something she's been building toward, and she said, "I told you this was reckless." I told her I remembered. She said, "I wasn't entirely wrong. I want to say that first, because I still think the version I was imagining when I said it would have been reckless." I told her that seemed fair. She said, "But what I was imagining and what this actually is are not the same thing." And I didn't understand that until I came here and saw it. She said she'd been imagining, when I'd described the move, something like an isolated version of me in a place I didn't know anyone, further from help than before, with the grief just relocated, but otherwise unchanged. She said she'd been imagining that what she feared most, which was losing me in some incremental way to isolation and decline, would just happen faster, somewhere farther away from her. She said what she'd found instead was a person with more of an actual life than she'd seen from me since before Helen got sick. Not a performed life, not the version people perform for visiting relatives, but the version you can tell is real because of the dozen small incidental details that would be too much trouble to stage. Mang Ernesto's opinions and Edgar's coffee, and the fact that the man at the food stall along the boulevard had started preparing my order when he saw me coming from half a block away, without my asking, the same way Carmen's Bakery had started doing for Harold in Tagaytay, the same way these things happen when you've become a real presence in a place, rather than a visitor passing through it. She said, and this is the thing I've held on to since she said it, that coming here had changed not just what she thought about my decision, but what she understood about what I actually needed. She said she thought she'd been offering me safety, and she had been, but the safety she'd been offering was the kind that was really a way of keeping everything still and known and manageable from her vantage point, which was 40 minutes away in Arizona. And that what she could see now, here, was that what I'd actually needed was not stillness. That stillness for a person in grief can, if you let it run long enough, become something indistinguishable from giving up, and that what I'd found here instead was the specific friction of being genuinely present in a life that required things from me, and that friction was, apparently, exactly what I'd needed without either of us quite knowing how to name it before I came here and found it. We sat out there for a long time after she said that. The light went out of the sky slowly, the way it does here, and the boulevard below started its evening version of itself, the walkers and the food vendors and the families, and we didn't need to fill the silence, and we didn't. On her second-to-last evening, Edgar organized a dinner at a small restaurant along the waterfront that he apparently frequented enough that they'd reserved a specific table without being asked. And Robert came, and Sol came, and Tessie came, and Dr. Constantino came for an hour before he had to leave, and Mang Ernesto came and immediately occupied the chair at the head of the table where he clearly believed he belonged. Melissa sat between Edgar and Tessie and talked for 3 hours in a way I hadn't seen her talk in a social setting in a long time. The unguarded version of her that comes out when she feels genuinely comfortable and not responsible for managing a situation. I watched her from across that table, the way I'd watched her when she was young and I was trying to understand who she was becoming, and I thought that this was exactly the evidence I hadn't been able to offer her before she came, the kind you can't send in a phone call or an email, the kind that only exists in a room full of real people being real with each other. Her last morning, she hugged me at the door for a long time, the way she used to hug me when she was small and I was leaving for a long job, the kind of hug that means more than what it's doing. Then she stepped back and looked at me directly and said, "I came here to make sure you were okay, and I'm leaving knowing you're more than okay, and I'm not sure I have a category for that yet." I told her she could take her time finding one. She said she thought she might also need to come back, that there were things here she'd only started understanding, and that she wanted to understand them better. I told her any time she wanted, there was a second bedroom, and Edgar would drive, and Sol would probably know she was coming before the plane landed. She laughed at that, a real laugh, not the managed laugh of someone trying to seem more at ease than they are, and I watched her get into the car to the airport, and I stood in the doorway for a moment, after the car was gone the way you stand in a doorway when something that These days, for the first time in longer than I'd like to admit, I wake up most mornings already thinking about the day ahead instead of just enduring it, already running through before my feet even hit the floor, whatever small thing needs doing, whoever's expecting to see me, whatever ordinary plan the day already has in motion, whether I have much of an opinion about it or not. I don't say that to suggest everything is perfect now, because it isn't. And I don't think any honest version of a story like this should pretend otherwise. There are still hard days. There's still an ache that never fully closes, and I've come to accept that it probably never will, and that this is all right, that it doesn't need fixing the way I once assumed it did. But underneath that ache, there's also now a real and steady pull toward tomorrow, something I'd lost for a long stretch of time and genuinely wasn't sure I'd get back. I did get it back, though, not all at once. And not because of any single dramatic decision, but because of a long accumulation of small, deliberate choices, each one modest on its own, that eventually added up to an entirely different life than the one I'd been quietly drowning in before.